a rusted, forgotten mailbox buried in the attic. But inside were no ordinary letters. They were desperate cries for help, abandoned by time. An 11-year-old boy accidentally uncovers the darkest truth hiding within his own home. From that moment on, he was no longer a child, but a witness to what had been buried, a voice daring to expose a rotten system. When the adults stayed silent, one child stood up, and the world had no choice but to listen. Don't miss this haunting journey of tears, rage, and justice. Hit subscribe now to follow our most gripping and unforgettable true interrogation films. The wind howled through the empty streets of Billings, Montana, as rain lashed against rooftops and lightning fractured the sky. Inside the creaking wooden house, 11-year-old Ethan tiptoed barefoot through the hallway, heart pounding, drawn to a strange pull coming from the storage shed behind their home. It was past midnight, and thunder masked the squeak of the door as he entered the damp, forgotten space. Stacks of old boxes and broken furniture cast long shadows. His flashlight flickered across a rusted metal container tucked beneath an old tarp. Curiosity flared. He dragged it out, wiped off the grime, and realized it was a mailbox. His mother's name, Sarah, barely visible beneath layers of dust and time. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the latch. Inside, dozens of yellowed envelopes sat like time capsules. The ink had faded, but not the pain. Ethan pulled one out, unfolded the fragile paper, and began to read. The words were not addressed to anyone in particular, just desperate messages filled with fear, despair, and silent screams. Letters his mother had written to escape. Letters that had never been mailed. Lightning lit up the shed, revealing Ethan's pale, stunned face. The words on the paper burned into his memory. I don't know how much longer I can survive. Please, someone help me before he kills me. He sank to the ground, knees drawn to his chest, letter pressed tightly to his chest. Mark, his father, was not just strict. He was violent, manipulative, and always made sure no bruises showed when company came. Now Ethan knew for sure. His mother had tried to cry out. The world just never listened. One by one, Ethan read the letters, each more harrowing than the last. They detailed nights of silence broken only by screams, mornings filled with apologies that meant nothing, and countless times Sarah had thought about running, but stayed for Ethan. The last letter ended with a chilling line. If this is found and I'm gone, tell Ethan I love him more than life itself. Rain hammered louder. The walls felt like they were closing in. Ethan clutched the letters to his chest and whispered to the shadows, I hear you now, Mom. I won't let this stay buried. The morning rain lingered, casting a gray veil over the town. Dim light pushed its way through dusty kitchen windows, falling upon a cold, silent room. Sarah stood by the sink, her thin shoulders trembling, not from the chill, but from the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. Water ran over bruised, swollen fingers, marks from the night before, hidden beneath long sleeves and a worn, practiced smile. She had once been vibrant, a young woman with golden hair and a laugh that lit up summers in Missoula. Now she moved like a ghost in her own home, careful and calculated, as if walking across a minefield. Every step, every sound, was a potential trigger for Mark's rage. Sarah never questioned, never raised her voice. She cooked, cleaned, endured. Every morning was the same. Meals prepared mechanically, like a ritual void of soul. But inside her, a quiet storm brewed. It wasn't just the bruises that hurt. It was the look in Ethan's eyes. Her son had learned to witness pain without asking questions. And that broke her more than the blows ever could. When Mark entered a room, Sarah's eyes dropped instinctively. No visitor ever saw the injuries beneath her makeup and long sleeves. But Ethan did. Even without words, her body spoke volumes, and her son had become fluent in her silence. He noticed every hesitation, every flinch. Their home was always quiet. No laughter, no music, just the ticking of a clock and the heavy echo of footsteps. When Mark left for work, Sarah could breathe, just a little. But the fear remained. She knew that one wrong word, one stray glance, could bring consequences worse than before. Upstairs, Ethan sat by his window with an old book open on his lap. He wasn't reading. His eyes wandered beyond the pages, watching pine trees sway in the wind, the clouds thick and unmoving. At 11 years old, Ethan carried the silence of someone much older. He had no friends, spoke little, and avoided eye contact, especially with his father. At school, teachers labeled him quiet or reserved, but they never knew why. Ethan returned home without delay, never caused trouble, always kept his grades up, not from passion, but from fear. The less attention he drew, the safer his mother would be. Ethan was a sharp observer. He remembered every time Mark came home smelling of alcohol. He remembered how Sarah would step back subtly, how her hands trembled. He remembered the apologies too, the hollow promises that always came before the storm. To Ethan, his father wasn't a man. He was a storm in human form, calm one minute, then destroying everything the next. At night, Ethan pretended to sleep early, but under the covers, he listened. Heavy footsteps, clinking glass, muffled cries. He memorized each sound like secret codes only he understood. And every night, he dreamed of another place. Somewhere his mother could smile. Somewhere he could close his eyes without fear of screaming in the dark. One day, his teacher, Ms. Emily, asked softly, "Is everything okay at home?" Ethan only looked down. There were moments he wanted to tell, about the bruises, the screaming, the fear. But then, in his mind, he saw Mark's clenched fist and his mother's silent tears. He stayed quiet. He was terrified that speaking would cost her everything. But something had changed after the night Ethan found the letters. He started looking at his mother differently, not just as someone needing protection, but as someone who had been crying out for years. From that moment, he became her silent guardian. He tracked the time Mark came home, how often Sarah was injured, what rooms stayed locked. He watched YouTube videos on how to install hidden cameras, studied them in secret. In those quiet minutes, Ethan grew, not in height or age, but in burden. He knew, if he didn't do something, one day someone wouldn't wake up. And if that happened, he would never forgive himself. At exactly 7:20 every morning, the school bell rang, and students trickled into homeroom with sleepy eyes and backpacks too heavy for their shoulders. But for Ethan, school wasn't just a place to learn. It was the only place where he could pretend, even briefly, that life was normal. And in room 14B stood the one person who saw through the silence he wore like armor, Ms. Emily Carter. Ms. Carter was in her early 30s, with soft eyes that always seemed to be searching, not for mistakes, but for unspoken truths. She wasn't the kind of teacher who raised her voice. She had a quiet firmness that made students respect her, and a warmth that made them feel safe. But with Ethan, something always felt off. He never spoke unless called on, never laughed at the class jokes, and flinched every time someone shut a door too hard. She noticed the subtle things. The way Ethan's hands trembled when passing papers. The way he sat at the very edge of his seat, alert, like he expected danger even here. And most of all, the way he never mentioned his parents. Not once. It had started months ago. A bruise on Ethan's wrist he couldn't explain. The sudden decline in his drawings, from vibrant colors to blacks and grays. She brought it up gently, asking if he'd fallen or hurt himself. Ethan smiled and said he tripped in the woods. But the way he smiled, it wasn't the smile of a boy who made a mistake. It was the smile of a boy trying to survive. Emily Carter had seen signs like these before. Years ago, as a volunteer at a youth shelter in Denver, she had met children who wore fear like second skin. She had learned to trust her instincts. But instinct alone wasn't enough. She had no evidence, No bruises she could document, no statements she could present. Only a growing unease that something behind Ethan's silence was deeply wrong. She kept a journal, notes about Ethan, dates when he missed school, changes in behavior. She was careful, methodical, hoping that someday, if the truth surfaced, she'd be ready. But still, it tore at her every time Ethan walked out the door with his head down, shoulders curled in. One rainy Thursday afternoon, she stayed behind grading papers while the last of her students trickled out. Ethan lingered longer than usual. His steps were slow, uncertain. As he reached her desk, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, eyes wide, nervous, pleading. Emily put down her pen. "You okay, Ethan?" He hesitated. His hand reached into his backpack, pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing an old envelope. A letter. One of the ones from his mother. Emily read the first few lines, her breath catching. "He told me if I ever spoke up, he'd bury me where no one would find me." Ethan didn't explain. He didn't need to. That letter spoke louder than any confession. And in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. This wasn't just a good student with quiet tendencies. This was a child in danger. Emily looked at him gently. "Do you have more of these?" Ethan nodded. "I want you to trust me, okay?" That was the first time Ethan looked her in the eyes. Truly looked. And in her, he saw something no adult had shown him before. Conviction. Not pity, not curiosity. Just the quiet strength of someone who had decided, enough was enough. From that day on, Emily became his anchor. He began leaving more letters in her drawer. Sometimes notes. Sometimes flash drives with short video clips. Shaky footage of arguments through walls. Faint screams. Shadows moving violently under the door. The kind of proof that turned suspicion into certainty. She reported what she could, but the wheels of the system turned slowly. Too slowly. The local police deflected. The school counselor promised to look into it. But Emily knew what she was up against. Mark wasn't just a father. He was well-liked, involved in community events, friends with a police captain. A man whose darkness wore a charming mask. Still, she didn't stop. She documented everything. She met Ethan in the library during lunch breaks. She taught him how to record discreetly, how to back up files, how to speak if questioned. She told him the truth. The world didn't always listen, but if they gathered enough noise, someone eventually would. And Ethan trusted her. Not instantly. Trust was something his home life had strangled. But over time, the way she never pushed too hard, never acted like a savior, but always showed up. That broke through his walls. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel alone. He began walking taller. Just slightly. He began writing in his journal again. At home, things hadn't changed. Mark's anger hadn't disappeared. But Ethan had a plan now. A partner. A thread of hope to follow in the dark. Emily, meanwhile, knew time was running out. Something about Ethan's recent videos, the sharpness of Mark's threats, the bruises on Sarah's neck, made her realize the storm was close. She spent nights reading up on child protection law, contacting distant connections from her shelter days, sending anonymous tips when the police ignored her. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was the only adult Ethan could turn to, and she refused to fail him. On a quiet Saturday evening, as the golden sun dipped behind the pine trees behind the house, Ethan sat alone in his locked bedroom. His old laptop, once used for homework, now served a much different purpose. He opened an incognito browser and typed the words, "How to install a hidden camera." His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. He studied every step. Which mini camera was easiest to hide, how to disguise it among personal items, how to store footage without being caught. He took careful notes with a pencil in a notebook he had taped behind the bookshelf, hidden in a place no one would ever look. Over the next week, Ethan saved every penny he could, Spare change from lunch money, coins found in couch cushions. He bought a small clock camera online using a fake name and arranged for it to be delivered to a bookstore in town. He told his mother he was going to read comics, like every weekend. When the package arrived, his heart pounded. This was no longer a curiosity. It was a decision, a line he was crossing without a way back. That night, while Mark sat watching TV downstairs, Ethan slipped into his mother's room, pretending to cuddle next to her like he often did. When the hallway lights shut off and silence fell over the house, he slowly reached beneath the pillow and pulled out the disguised camera. In the dark, he taped it to the bookshelf, angled it carefully toward the bedroom door and the bed. He had calculated the view perfectly. Every movement was silent, precise. One creak could ruin everything. But Ethan didn't flinch. He had made up his mind. If the world wouldn't see the truth, he would show it. The next day, while Mark was out, Ethan removed the memory card and plugged it into his laptop. The first recording was uneventful. His mother lying asleep, face pale with exhaustion, hand clutching the edge of her blanket. Nothing unusual. But by the second and third night, everything began to change. He watched Mark enter the room, say something the mic didn't catch. Sarah sat up, startled. Mark slammed his fist against the dresser, grabbed her by the hair, and yanked. A loud slap echoed. She crumpled onto the bed. The image shook slightly. So did Ethan's hands as he watched. He couldn't finish the clip that night, but he knew he had to. Every night, he repeated the process. Set up, retrieve, review, store. Every night became another nightmare captured. And with each clip, the truth his mother had hidden for years became undeniable. It wasn't just physical abuse. It was soul-level imprisonment. It was the silent cries in her eyes that haunted Ethan most. In one of the videos, Mark kicked over a chair, his voice rising into a rage so sharp it made the camera mic crackle. Sarah covered her head, tried to escape into the bathroom. Mark yanked her back by the shirt. Ethan, watching from his screen, clenched his fists so tightly his nails broke the skin. He backed up the videos on a hidden hard drive, encrypted with a password no one else knew. But what haunted him most wasn't the hitting. It was his mother's face afterward. Still, numb, familiar with pain. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just nodded blankly as Mark stormed out, as if pain had become a part of her skin. Sometimes Ethan wondered why she never ran, why she never shouted. But deep down, he understood. She stayed. For him. Because if she left, Mark would turn his fists on their son. Sarah had made a silent vow. Take it all, just to keep Ethan safe. Now Ethan couldn't let that sacrifice continue. He began writing a plan in his coded notebook. Who would get the footage? When to send it? If something happened to him, who would know the password? At 11 years old, Ethan was living like a covert agent behind enemy lines, with one mission: save his mother. In one particular video, nearly 4 minutes long, Sarah collapsed by the window. Moonlight cast shadows over the bruises crawling from her cheek down her neck. She murmured something, so faint Ethan had to enhance the audio. I just don't want Ethan to see this. His heart shattered, but he had seen it. He knew, and he wasn't turning back. Beneath his school uniform, a warrior had begun to rise. Every step he took, every second of footage, brought him closer to the truth and to freedom. And Ethan understood. Every choice had a cost, but he was willing to pay it, if it meant his mother would never have to suffer in silence again. Monday. The sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and a biting wind slipped through the cracks in the school windows. Ethan arrived earlier than usual. He didn't greet anyone, didn't smile. He walked straight to his usual seat by the window. Inside his worn gray backpack was something that had kept his heart pounding all night. A small memory card sealed in a clear Ziploc bag. On it was his latest recording, sharp, painfully clear, and suffocating in its detail. Mark had shoved Sarah so hard her head struck the table. Ethan had watched it over and over. Each replay carved a new wound into his chest. He knew now he couldn't keep this to himself anymore. It was time to act, or everything would spiral beyond saving. During recess, while the other students scattered onto the playground, Ethan stayed behind. Ms. Emily was gathering her lesson plans, not noticing the boy quietly walking up to her desk with a frozen expression. He placed the small zip bag on her desk, his hand retreating as though the plastic burned him. Ms. Emily looked up, and their eyes met. Silent, desperate, pleading. "What's this, Ethan?" she asked gently, without pressure. Ethan lowered his gaze. "Please don't watch it here. Wait until you're home." His voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling but sincere. He turned to walk away, pausing briefly at the door. Without turning back, he said, "Please do something to help my mom." Emily stood still. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like someone who had been pushed too close to the edge. There was no anger, no tears, only a quiet plea from a child who had run out of options. A final whispered hope that someone, somewhere, would do what was right. She picked up the bag, gripping it like it held someone's life inside. That night, after returning home, she didn't turn on the lights. She closed all the blinds, sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and slowly inserted the memory card. The screen flickered to life. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her shoulder. Mark entered from behind, grabbed her forcefully. Her scream rang out. Something crashed. The footage trembled, but the audio was unmistakable. A slap, a thud. A woman gasping for breath. Emily broke down. There was no longer doubt. No more waiting. That boy had just placed his entire world in her hands, hoping she would save the only thing he had left, his mother. The next morning, Emily Carter walked into the Billings Police Department with a file in her hand and a storm in her chest. She wasn't there as a teacher. She was there as a witness, a protector. In her coat pocket, tightly gripped, was a small USB drive. On it, a video that would disturb any sane viewer and, if handled properly, could launch a formal investigation. She was asked to wait, and within minutes, an officer informed her, "Captain Tom Ridley will see you now." The name stopped her cold. Tom Ridley. She had seen him often at town events. A man with a booming laugh who always clapped Mark on the back during church functions and charity drives. A man Mark once called his brother in arms. Now he stood between the truth and justice. There was no turning back. Emily stepped into a private office, pulled out the USB, and placed it on the desk. "I'm here to report suspected domestic abuse, with video evidence. The victim is Sarah Thompson. The suspect is her husband, Mark Thompson." Ridley raised an eyebrow, slowly picking up the USB. He didn't plug it into his computer. Instead, he leaned forward, fingers steepled, eyes locked onto Emily. "Ms. Carter, I think you're overstepping," he said evenly, his tone controlled but cautious. "Mark's a respected citizen. He's done a lot for this town. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Emily clenched her fists. "I've seen the footage. This isn't a mistake. This is assault. This is a crime." The air in the room tightened. Ridley sighed, leaning back in his chair, still not touching the USB. "We'll take a look. These things take time." Emily understood exactly what had just happened. It wasn't a refusal on paper, but it was a refusal in practice. Worse yet, her fears had been confirmed. Mark wasn't just an abusive husband. He had allies in uniform. Driving home, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Her heart was racing. She had handed over hard evidence to someone who had no intention of using it. Not because the process failed, but because the person in charge was Mark's friend. And perhaps part of something even deeper. That night, in the quiet of her study, Emily opened her laptop. She checked the backup USB. The original had never left her house. Then she began to dig. Who exactly was Tom Ridley? How many domestic violence cases in Billings had quietly disappeared? She traced patterns in old reports, dismissed complaints, and abruptly closed cases. A pattern began to emerge. Those close to Ridley, his friends, his associates, seemed to benefit from a blind eye. Many victims were single women, immigrants, or struggling mothers. All had filed complaints. None were protected. And Mark Thompson? His name appeared once, back in 2016, tied to a domestic dispute. Case closed within 48 hours. No explanation. Emily felt sick. This wasn't just a family matter. This was a network, where violence hid behind friendship, reputation, and power. She began to write. A detailed report. She sent it to child protection agencies, to public defenders in the nearest cities, to independent journalists she had met back when she volunteered in Denver. She didn't dramatize it. Just facts and evidence. At that moment, Emily knew she wasn't just standing up for Ethan anymore. She was confronting a system designed to keep boys like him quiet, and she would not stay silent in their place. One moonless night, Mark returned home earlier than usual. Ethan was in his room doing homework, and Sarah had just finished washing dishes in the kitchen. The atmosphere was the same as always. Quiet, tense, every footstep echoing across the wooden floor. But there was something different in Mark's eyes that night. Not fatigue, suspicion, like an animal that senses a trap. While Sarah went upstairs to gather laundry, Mark entered the bedroom. The soft yellow light illuminated the table where the alarm clock sat, the same clock that had been secretly recording his abuse for weeks. He bent over, turned it gently, and saw it. A small gap, a hidden lens. It was unmistakable. Mark exploded. He roared, flipping the table, sending objects crashing to the floor. The clock shattered under his boot. Downstairs, Sarah heard the chaos and rushed up, but before she could say a word, Mark grabbed her arm and yanked her down the stairs like a rag doll. Ethan opened his door just in time to see it all and froze in horror. "You think you're smart, huh? This was you, wasn't it?" Mark bellowed, eyes bloodshot as he dragged Sarah toward the basement, a part of the house that had been locked for years. The heavy metal door was flung open with a key he always kept on his belt. No explanation, no chance to resist. Below was a cold, cement-walled room with flickering lights. No windows, no phone. Just a thin mattress, a bucket, and rough, painted brick. Mark shoved Sarah inside and slammed the door shut. The click of the lock sounded like a death sentence. Sarah curled up in the corner, silent tears streaming down her face. She didn't scream. She knew better. Resistance only fed his rage. Her chest ached, not just from being dragged, but from the look in Ethan's eyes. Terrified, helpless, shattered. Upstairs, Ethan stood frozen in front of the locked basement door. He was trembling, the echo of his mother's scream still ringing in his ears. He wanted to run after her, to yell. But he knew. One wrong move, and Mark would turn his rage on them both. Mark emerged from the basement like a predator that had just crushed a threat. He looked at Ethan. Not a word, not a gesture. Just a stare that said everything. "I know. And you better watch yourself." That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat curled up outside his room, knees to chest, listening for any sound from beneath the floorboards. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. The woman who used to stroke his hair each night now lay in darkness, just a few feet away. And there was nothing he could do. The next morning, Mark locked the basement and left for work as if nothing had happened. Ethan waited until the house fell silent. He crept over to the hallway rug, pulled it aside, and pressed his ear against the floor. "Mama?" he whispered. Silence. Then, a faint knock. 3 soft taps, a pause, another knock. Ethan broke down for the first time in weeks. Not with screams, but silent sobs. He hugged himself against the wall, clutching the notebook where every plan was taking shape. And now, it wasn't about defense anymore. It was time to strike back. That weekend, Mark came up with a reason. He told Ethan they needed a change of scenery and said they'd go into the woods together. Ethan stayed silent during the entire drive. Cold wind seeped through the truck's cracked window as he clenched his fists in his lap. He knew something was wrong. Sarah was still locked away, still unseen. And now Mark wanted to take him away for a few days? No police, no questions. It was a trap. Mark's pickup truck wound through narrow dirt roads and plunged deep into the Flathead Forest, an unforgiving stretch of wilderness in northern Montana, where cell reception died and help felt like a myth. Years ago, Mark had worked at a so-called survival training camp out here. Since the pandemic, it had been abandoned. But Mark still had the keys. When the truck finally stopped, Ethan stared out the window at a row of weathered wooden cabins, half consumed by moss and silence. No engines, no voices, only the whisper of the forest. The trees stretched high and dense like sentinels. Ethan swallowed hard. He could feel it. This was no retreat. It was a prison without walls. "We'll stay here a few days. Toughen you up," Mark said, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. The grip lingered. Ethan didn't answer. His lips were dry. His thoughts burned with worry. Was his mother even still alive? That first night in the cabin, Mark locked Ethan inside with a rusty padlock. No electricity, no cell signal, just a splintering wooden bed, an oil lamp, and a half-empty water bottle. Ethan curled up in the corner, straining to hear anything outside. Mark slept in another cabin nearby, but Ethan knew better than to run. The forest was endless, unfamiliar, and unforgiving. The next morning, Mark allowed Ethan out to fetch water from a nearby stream. That's when Ethan started noticing things. Bloodstains, old and dark, streaked the ground near a small storage shack. Close by were rusted industrial coolers, chained shut. The stench wasn't animal decay. It was heavier, foul, human. Later, while Mark napped, Ethan slipped from his cabin and pried open the back door of the supply building. Inside, the air was colder, preserved. Lined up were body storage containers. On a shelf under a tarp, he found a clipboard. Names, blood types, dates. Beside them, red X's. Some of the names were children. Ethan froze. Mark wasn't just violent. He was involved in something far darker, a trafficking ring, organ harvesting. This place, this training camp, was a cover. Those kids who disappeared during forest hikes, they never left these woods. And now Ethan knew. He wasn't just being punished. He was next. Back in his cabin, Ethan began scribbling notes. Every detail. Where the containers were kept, what the list looked like, how many names he could remember, the timing of Mark's movements. If he made it out, these notes would be the evidence. But no one knew he was here. That night, from his corner of the room, he overheard Mark's voice on a shortwave radio. It was brief, grating. "The package is ready. Transport tomorrow." The blood drained from Ethan's face. He was the package. In the suffocating black of Flathead Forest, with his mother imprisoned in a basement miles away and a nightmare tightening its grip, Ethan made a vow. If he survived tomorrow, he would make sure the whole world knew what had happened out here. That night, the sky was clear and bitterly cold. The moon had just dipped behind the distant mountain ridge. Ethan hadn't slept. He sat curled beside the cabin window, clutching his notebook, listening to every sound in the woods. Each snapping twig and gust of wind made his heart lurch. He knew. If he didn't escape tonight, tomorrow morning would be the end. Around midnight, as Mark snored in a drunken haze from dinner, a faint beam of light flickered outside the window. Ethan froze. His heart raced, terrified it was Mark checking in. But the light wasn't aggressive. It swept past gently, like a signal. Then a soft knock on the wooden door. 3 short taps. A pause. "Ethan?" A low voice, steady, quiet, familiar. Ethan leaned in, pressing his ear against the wood. "I'm John. John Teller. I used to work here with your dad. I know what's going on." Ethan's eyes widened. His voice cracked. "Can you help me?" The door creaked open slightly. A tall man with a rough beard and a worn leather jacket stepped in. His flashlight caught the tired determination in his eyes. John Teller, once the head of security at this very camp. He had walked away years ago after sensing something was wrong. But now he was back, drawn by an anonymous message from an old contact. A warning. A boy is being held in Flathead. I always knew Mark wasn't just running survival drills, John whispered. I suspected those missing kids back then, but never had proof. Now I do. Ethan pressed his notebook into John's hand. Everything's in here. Passwords, locations, the names. John nodded, wrapping Ethan in a spare coat. Come on, we need to get down this mountain, now. They crept through the trees under a thin layer of moonlight. Ethan stayed close to John, his heart thudding like war drums. Mark was still asleep, but that could change any second. They crossed an icy stream, pushed through tall reeds, and spent nearly 2 hours navigating the forest to reach an old pickup John had hidden under a tarp near the foothills. As they climbed into the truck, Ethan asked, "Did you tell anyone?" John nodded. "A woman named Emily Carter. Your teacher, right? I got a satellite signal just before I entered camp. She already contacted the FBI. They're on their way." Ethan burst into tears again, this time because of hope. The engine roared to life, echoing through the woods. Behind them, the Flathead camp disappeared into the darkness. But this time, the darkness wouldn't hide the truth. For the first time, Ethan wasn't running away. He was returning to fight. Just hours after John Teller helped Ethan escape the camp, Emily received the call. The voice on the other end was rough and urgent. "This is John Teller. Ethan is safe. We have evidence. You need to send everything else to the FBI right now." Emily nearly dropped her phone. She rushed to her computer and unlocked the encrypted hard drive she had only dared to look at late at night. Everything was there. The original videos, photos of Ethan's handwritten notes, the cabin map, the list of names, Mark's documented patterns. She moved everything into a secured folder labeled Flathead Unmasked and ran one final layer of encryption. Without hesitation, she sent the folder through a secure FBI intake portal, a connection established weeks ago through a former college friend who now worked in the Helena field office. Her message was short. "All evidence is ready. Ethan survived. Mark Thompson is not working alone." 40 minutes later, a reply appeared. "Received. Rapid response team en route to Flathead. Thank you for your courage." Emily collapsed into her chair, her heart pounding. Outside her window, the sky was just beginning to lighten, but another kind of storm was rising, a storm of justice. Deep within the Flathead wilderness, the rumble of helicopters shook the trees. An elite FBI tactical unit, joined by state agents, moved silently through the trails surrounding the abandoned survival camp. They were fully armed, guided by aerial maps and, most importantly, by Ethan's journal. What had once been a frightened child's survival plan was now a blueprint for a federal raid. They weren't just hunting Mark. They were dismantling a network. As the teams deployed into formation, Emily stayed on the line with the lead agent. Her voice was calm, but firm. "I don't need credit," she said. "Just find Sarah, and make sure Ethan never has to see something like this again." The operation had begun, and this time, the darkness would have nowhere left to hide. In the cold, dark basement, Sarah lay curled against the wall, her breathing shallow as mist. Her eyes were half closed, her body pale and bruised, unable to tell day from night. Each passing minute was a battle to stay conscious. No food, no light. Only the steady drip of water from a rusted pipe above her head, counting down what little time she had left. Mark hadn't returned in 3 days. Sarah didn't know where Ethan was, or if anyone was coming. But in that darkness, one thing still kept her holding on. The memory of Ethan's voice, calling from above, faint and desperate. "Mom, can you hear me?" She couldn't give up. Not yet. Even if all she had left was a flicker of breath, she would hold on. For Ethan, back in the town of Billings, where it all began, the silence began to crack. A surprise investigative report from an independent journalist went viral, showing images pulled from Ethan's video footage alongside a map of the Flathead camp. Online forums lit up. Social media flooded with calls to action, tagging the local police department by name. Pressure was rising fast and from everywhere. But inside the local precinct, Captain Tom Ridley maintained his stance. "There is no official confirmation. We are following procedure," he told reporters, his tone flat and deflective. Every question met the same rehearsed line. But the media wasn't staying silent anymore. A major news outlet released a leaked audio clip, an internal phone call between a local officer and a state official, revealing how the department had delayed action, citing lack of sufficient evidence. Meanwhile, the FBI had boots on the ground in Flathead Forest, sweeping the camp one structure at a time. By the second night of the operation, a federal response team came upon a concrete bunker half buried beneath dead leaves and rotting wood. One agent paused. Something faint, barely audible. A scratching sound against stone. They breached the door. Sarah lay motionless, her skin cold, her eyes shut, but her chest still rose and fell. A medic shouted, "She's alive! I've got a pulse!" They carried her out on a stretcher. She couldn't speak, but as the flashlight beam passed over her face, a single tear traced a line down her cheek. The silence had been broken, and the whole country was listening. At the FBI field office in Helena, Ethan sat quietly at the interview table. Soft lighting cast shadows across his face. Tired, but resolute. In front of him were two federal agents and a trauma specialist. They didn't pressure him. They didn't rush. They knew they were listening to a boy who had just survived hell and might be the key witness in exposing an entire criminal operation. Ethan opened his notebook. In a calm, deliberate voice, he pointed to each page. "This is where I was locked up. This is the list of names. This is the camera. John Teller can confirm everything." He described it all. The location of the underground bunker, how Mark kept his mother imprisoned, the night he planted the camera, the secret recordings, and his escape. Every detail matched the physical evidence the FBI had recovered. Not a single discrepancy. With every word, the investigation shifted from suspicion to irrefutable proof. "You're very brave, Ethan," one of the agents said. "Thanks to you, we can take down this entire network." But the danger wasn't over yet. Elsewhere, Emily, the teacher who had risked everything, became a target. After the case made national headlines, she began receiving anonymous calls. At first, it was silence. Then came the threats. "You should shut your mouth. Don't think the FBI can protect you forever." One night, while driving home from school, Emily noticed a car parked 2 houses away from hers. Headlights off. The figure inside didn't move. Her pulse spiked. She quietly reversed, hand gripping her bag, pulled out her phone, and called the federal contact assigned to Ethan's case. "There's someone watching my house." 10 minutes later, an FBI vehicle arrived. The unknown car was gone, disappeared into the dark. Emily was placed under temporary witness protection, just as federal arrest warrants for Mark and his known associates were formally issued. In that moment, she understood. Standing on the side of truth meant inviting danger from every direction. But she didn't back down. She had made a promise to Ethan. And now, the entire country was watching the people who dared to speak up. At dawn, the Flathead Forest lay shrouded in thick fog. Heavy boots crunched over damp soil, measured, steady, and deliberate. A federal tactical team advanced toward the underground bunker, following a hand-drawn map built from Ethan's and John Teller's intel. This was where they believed Sarah was still being held. One agent approached a wall of rock tangled with roots and tapped it lightly. Hollow echo. A hidden room. The order came swiftly. The metal door exploded open with a controlled charge. Flashlights cut through the dark. No one spoke. Each movement sharp, guns steady, eyes focused. Then a voice. "We've got a live one." Sarah was slumped in the corner, barely recognizable. Her body gaunt, her lips pale, but her eyes fluttered open in the light. She couldn't speak, but when someone whispered, "Ethan," She blinked and gave the faintest nod. People say the dying always know when something still matters. She was lifted gently onto a stretcher, wrapped in layers of warm blankets, and rushed toward the waiting medevac helicopter perched atop a ridge. On the way up, she reached out and grasped a nurse's hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes said everything. I survived. At the same time, farther north in the Flathead camp, another tactical unit stormed a decrepit storage building marked off-limits by John Teller's notes. The door was pried open with crowbars. Inside, the air was thick, rotten, and heavy. In the corner stood a row of industrial freezers. One of them still hummed, powered by a backup generator. When opened, the agents froze. Even seasoned crime scene officers clenched their jaws. Bags of human organs, labeled, tagged, blood-typed. The lead agent spoke firmly. Document everything. Photograph, seal, log. This is federal-level evidence. Mark was captured less than a mile away, attempting to flee through a back trail toward the highway. He carried a small backpack stuffed with cash, a satellite phone, and a pistol. He never got the chance to draw it. 2 agents tackled him within seconds. Mark Thompson, one agent declared while cuffing him, "You are under arrest for human trafficking, domestic abuse, unlawful imprisonment, illegal organ trade, and attempted murder." Mark didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just stared at the ground, knowing at last there was no one left to protect him, and the nightmare had finally begun to unravel. The Flathead County Courthouse was packed on the morning of the first public hearing. Media crews crowded the entrance, broadcasting every moment live. From local ranchers to national reporters, everyone had come to witness the downfall of a man once praised as a model citizen, Mark Thompson. Mark sat behind the defendant's table, face expressionless. The orange prison uniform made him appear smaller beneath the courthouse's towering ceiling. Across from him, Ethan and Sarah sat under protective watch. Sarah's hand was still weak, but she held tightly to her son's, refusing to let go. The prosecutor stepped forward and presented a case file over 400 pages thick, backed by dozens of hours of footage, recordings, sworn testimony, and FBI investigative reports. At the heart of the case were 3 indisputable charges: systematic domestic abuse, human trafficking, specifically involving minors, and concealment of violent crimes aided by corrupt officials. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense's arguments faded under the weight of documentation and witness accounts, their rebuttals flimsy and unraveling. The jury didn't take long to deliberate, but what shocked the public wasn't just Mark's impending sentence. It was the names that followed. Later that same afternoon, indictments were announced for 4 officers in the Billings Police Department, including Captain Tom Ridley himself. Their charges: obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting criminal activity, and abuse of authority to suppress investigations. The truth was laid bare. A system that tried to silence Ethan, Sarah, and even Emily had instead ignited one of the most far-reaching internal investigations Montana had seen in over a decade. As the judge read the final ruling aloud, Ethan turned to his mother. He didn't cry, but in his eyes burned something new, something powerful, the light of someone who had survived, and someone finally beginning to heal. A gentle autumn morning in Colorado Springs. Sunlight filtered through the amber and crimson leaves of tall maple trees. On the small balcony of a modest apartment near the local high school, Ethan sat watching his mother tend to a row of newly planted flowers. Every motion Sarah made was slow, but peaceful. Something she never thought she'd feel again. Their new life began quietly. No press, no questions, just the silence they needed to heal. Ethan enrolled in a school with specialized counseling support, while Sarah took a part-time job at a neighborhood bookstore. Each passing day was a step forward. Not to forget, but to continue. Elsewhere, at a state-level recognition ceremony, Ms. Emily Carter stepped up to receive the Courageous Citizen of the Year award. The crowd rose in thunderous applause for the ordinary woman who had done the extraordinary, believed a child when the rest of the world turned away. Pinned to her chest was a silver badge engraved with, "The One Who Listened." After the ceremony, A reporter asked what had kept her going through it all. Emily smiled gently. Because I made a promise to a boy. If he found the courage to speak, I would find the courage to never stay silent. 2 weeks later, at his desk in a quiet bedroom, Ethan opened a fresh notebook and began writing on the first page. Sometimes, the truth is hidden in the oldest things. He thought of the rusted mailbox forgotten in the storage shed, the letters never sent, the stories no one had ever read. And then he thought, if he hadn't opened it that day, if he hadn't dared to face what was real, maybe his mother wouldn't be alive now. Ethan looked out the window. Neighborhood kids rode bikes, laughing in the distance. The wind rustled the golden leaves, carrying the breath of a new season. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he knew he was no longer alone. Listen to the children, he wrote next, because sometimes they're the only ones telling the truth.